Welcome to the Sleep Society. Tonight we are traveling back into the world of the Aztecs, a remarkable civilization that rose in central Mexico and built one of the most impressive cities in the ancient world. They are remembered for their temples, their markets, their warriors, their beliefs, and their vast capital of Tenochtitlan. Subscribe for more calm history and facts to sleep to. As we begin, allow the mind to slow down and settle. There is no need to remember every detail. You can simply listen as the story of the Aztecs unfolds piece by piece in a gentle and steady way, like ripples spreading across still water. Their world was rich with color, sound, ritual, trade, farming, craftsmanship, and careful order. It was also a world shaped by ambition, conflict, faith, and the constant rhythm of daily life. Long before the Aztec Empire reached its height, the Valley of Mexico was already home to many people. This highland basin, surrounded by mountains and volcanoes, contained a system of lakes and fertile lands that supported communities for centuries. Different cities rose and fell there over time. Cultures traded with one another, fought one another, borrowed customs from one another, and left behind ideas that later peoples would inherit. The Aztecs did not appear in an empty land. They entered a region filled with history. According to later tradition, the people we call the Aztecs were originally known as the Mexica. Their story tells of a long migration from a distant homeland called Aztlan. Historians are not certain exactly where this place was, and some believe it may have been more symbolic than geographical. But in Aztec memory, Aztlan represented a point of origin, a place from which their ancestors began a difficult journey. That journey became part of their identity. It helped define them as a people chosen for a special destiny, even if that destiny involved hardship before greatness. As the story was told, the Mexica wandered for many years. They moved from place to place, searching for the land that had been promised to them by their patron god, Huitzilopochtli. This god, associated with the sun and with war, guided them through signs and priestly messages. Their migration was not described as easy. It was filled with uncertainty, waiting, and struggle. In this way, the Aztecs remembered themselves not simply as conquerors, but as a people tested by endurance. Eventually, they came into the Valley of Mexico. By then, other more established city-states already occupied the region. The Mexica were not at first powerful or admired. In many accounts, they were seen as outsiders, rough newcomers without the prestige of older centers. They had to survive on the margins, sometimes serving stronger rulers as mercenaries, sometimes seeking land where others did not wish to settle. Their early years in the valley were marked by vulnerability rather than dominance. This part of their history is especially interesting because it shows how quickly fortunes can change in the ancient world. A people with little status can, within a few generations, become the center of a major empire. But at the beginning, the Mexica were still searching for their place. They needed land, stability, and a political foothold. They also needed a sign. That sign, according to tradition, was an eagle perched on a cactus, often described as holding a serpent, seen on an island in Lake Texcoco. There, the Mexica founded the city of Tenochtitlan in the year 1325, or near that date according to most reconstructions. The image became one of the most enduring symbols in Mexican history, and even today it appears on the flag of modern Mexico. For the Mexica, it was proof that they had reached the place chosen for them. At first glance, the site may not have seemed ideal. It was marshy, surrounded by lake water, and difficult in many practical ways. Building a city there required determination, ingenuity, and constant labor. Yet the location also offered advantages. Water could serve as protection. Causeways could control access. Canoes could move goods through canals. With time, the island city became not a desperate settlement, but a marvel of planning and adaptation. The people of Tenochtitlan built upward and outward. They drove wooden piles into wet ground, laid foundations, created streets and canals, and gradually shaped the island into an urban center. Houses, temples, plazas, and marketplaces took form. Over time, neighboring settlements grew close as well, including Tlatelolco, which would become famous for its market. Together, these communities turned the lake landscape into something extraordinary. One of the most ingenious features of life around Tenochtitlan was the use of chinampas, often called floating gardens, though they were not truly floating in the way the phrase suggests. These were carefully constructed agricultural plots made in shallow lake areas by layering mud, vegetation, and other materials to create fertile rectangles of land. Farmers planted maize, beans, squash, chilies, flowers, and other crops there. The system was highly productive and helped feed the growing population of the city. When people imagine great ancient civilizations, they often think first of kings, temples, wars, and treasures, but civilizations stand on food. Without stable agriculture, no great city can last for long. The Aztecs understood this well. Their farmers supported the entire social order. Chinampa agriculture, combined with tribute from conquered regions and trade through market networks, made urban life possible at a large scale, and Tenochtitlan grew large indeed. By the early 16th century, many estimates place its population in the hundreds of thousands, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Exact numbers are difficult to know, and historians continue to debate them, but there is little doubt that the city impressed those who saw it. Spanish observers later described causeways, canals, temples, crowded markets, and a level of urban organization that surprised them deeply. It is worth pausing to imagine the feeling of entering the city in its prime. After traveling across the valley and approaching over the water, a visitor would have seen gleaming temples rising above the island, white buildings and painted surfaces catching the sunlight, canoes moving through canals, and causeways stretching across the lake like deliberate lines. Mountains stood in the distance. The whole setting must have seemed almost dreamlike, a city between earth and water. But Tenochtitlan was not only beautiful, it was also political, ceremonial, and strategic. At its center stood the sacred precinct, a major ceremonial zone containing temples and important religious buildings. The most famous structure there was the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, which was dedicated to two deities, Huitzilopochtli, linked to the sun and war, and Tlaloc, associated with rain and agricultural fertility. This pairing reflected a deep truth about Aztec life. Society depended both on power in war and on success in farming. To modern listeners, Aztec religion can seem unfamiliar, dramatic, and sometimes disturbing. It was built on a worldview in which the cosmos required nourishment, balance, and repetition of sacred acts. The universe was not assumed to continue on its own without effort. Divine forces had sacrificed themselves to set the world in motion, and human beings, in turn, had obligations to sustain that order. Rituals, offerings, festivals, music, dances, prayers, incense, and sacrifices all formed part of a larger cosmic relationship. This worldview was shaped by time itself. The Aztecs inherited and developed sophisticated calendar systems. One was a 260-day ritual calendar used for divination and sacred timing. Another was a 365-day solar calendar tied more closely to the agricultural year. These systems interlocked, producing repeating cycles that helped organize ceremonies, festivals, and omens. Time was not just counted, it was interpreted. Days carried meanings, associations, and possible destinies. In such a world, priests held important roles. They kept ritual knowledge, oversaw ceremonies, interpreted signs, and maintained temple life. Religion was not separate from politics or daily existence. It was woven through everything. Birth, naming, marriage, trade, farming, warfare, and rulership all had sacred dimensions. To understand the Aztecs, one must set aside the modern habit of dividing life neatly into categories. For them, the sacred and the practical were deeply connected. Rulers, too, stood within this sacred order. The Aztec Emperor, often called the Tlatoani, meaning the great speaker, was not merely a king in the European sense. He was a political leader, military commander, and ceremonial figure whose legitimacy depended on lineage, alliances, performance, and divine favor. His authority was real, but it was also embedded in a network of nobles, priests, military leaders, and city-state relationships. The rise of Aztec imperial power is often associated with an alliance formed in the 15th century between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. This is known as the Triple Alliance. After defeating rivals, especially the Tepanec city of Azcapotzalco, these allied powers expanded their influence across much of central Mexico and beyond. In practice, Tenochtitlan became the dominant partner over time, but the alliance helped create the political framework of empire. This empire was not built as a single unified nation in the modern sense. Instead, it operated largely through conquest and tribute. Subject cities and regions often remained in place under their own local rulers, as long as they paid what was demanded and did not rebel. Tribute could include goods such as cotton garments, cacao, maize, feathers, obsidian blades, jade, rubber, and many other items. The empire drew wealth from a wide range of climates and communities. Tribute lists, recorded in surviving documents, give us a fascinating glimpse into the scale and organization of the system. They show how many textiles, warrior costumes, shields, baskets of goods, or luxury items particular provinces were expected to send. The empire, in this sense, was a network of obligations flowing inward toward the center. These goods supported the nobility, the temples, the state, and sometimes the redistribution of prestige and resources. Yet tribute also created resentment. Not all subject peoples accepted Aztec rule gladly. Some paid because they had no choice. Others were rivals waiting for opportunities. This tension would later matter enormously when the Spanish arrived, because they did not defeat the Aztecs alone. They formed alliances with indigenous enemies of the empire. The Aztec state was powerful, but it was not universally loved. Still, before that dramatic ending, the civilization flourished in many domains. Trade reached far distances. Professional merchants, known as Pochteka, traveled across regions carrying valuable goods and sometimes gathering intelligence. Markets operated regularly, and the market at Tlatelolco was especially famous. Accounts describe thousands of people gathering there to buy and sell food, pottery, cloth, tools, ornaments, animals, and everyday necessities. Officials monitored weights, order, and fair conduct. The existence of such markets reminds us that Aztec life was not only about rulers and priests. Ordinary people filled the city and countryside with activity. Farmers worked the chinampas and fields. Craftsmen shaped stone, wood, gold, feathers, and clay. Women ground maize, cooked food, wove cloth, cared for households, and participated in trade. Porters carried goods, Canoe traffic crossed the water. Children learned their duties. Daily life, repeated again and again, sustained the entire civilization. Homes varied by status, of course, but many common households were built of adobe or other local materials and centered on practical family life. Maize formed the foundation of the diet, often prepared as tortillas, tamales, or gruels. Beans, squash, chilies, tomatoes, amaranth, and other crops enriched meals. There were also turkeys, dogs bred for food, fish, insects, and local plants, depending on the setting. Cacao was especially valued and could be consumed as a drink by elites, sometimes flavored with spices. Water management mattered constantly in the lake environment. The people of Tenochtitlan developed dikes, canals, and aqueducts to help control floods and bring fresh water into the city. One major challenge was that lake water could be brackish in some areas, so systems were needed to secure cleaner supplies. The engineering behind the city is often overshadowed by stories of war and ritual, but it deserves admiration in its own right. Building a large, functioning urban center in a lake basin required remarkable practical intelligence. Education was also important. Aztec society did not leave the training of the young to chance alone. Children learned discipline, household work, religion, and social expectations from an early age. There were schools for different groups. The Calmacac was associated more with noble education, priestly learning, and advanced training, while the Telpochcali focused more on military preparation and civic duty for commoner youths. The exact experiences varied, but the broader point is clear. The society expected its young people to be shaped intentionally. This emphasis on discipline can feel striking to modern readers. Aztec culture often valued endurance, self-control, hard work, and respect for order. Parents instructed children carefully. Moral speeches survive in written form, recorded after the conquest, which reveal ideals of humility, restraint, and proper conduct. These speeches, sometimes called Huehuetlatoli, or words of the elders, offer a gentle but firm window into the ethical tone of the society. They speak of balance, courtesy, and responsibility. The Aztecs also cultivated beauty. Featherwork, for example, reached astonishing levels of artistry. Skilled artisans arranged brilliant feathers from tropical birds into ceremonial pieces, shields, costumes, and luxury objects. Goldsmiths, potters, and stone carvers likewise created works of great refinement. Clothing itself could signal identity and rank. Nobles wore finer garments and ornaments, while warriors could earn the right to wear particular costumes or insignia based on achievements in battle. And battle mattered deeply. Warfare in the Aztec world was practical, political, and sacred all at once. Conquest expanded tribute networks and imperial reach. Military success brought honor and advancement. Captives taken in war could play roles in ritual sacrifice. Young men were trained to value bravery, discipline, and distinction on the battlefield. Different military orders, including elite warrior societies such as the Eagle and Jaguar warriors, became famous symbols of prestige and martial identity. Yet even here, one must be careful not to imagine the Aztecs only through the lens of violence. Warfare was indeed central, but it existed alongside farming, poetry, diplomacy, ceremony, trade, engineering, parenting, and artistic creation. Like all civilizations, the Aztec world contained contrasts. It could be harsh and beautiful, ordered and unstable, deeply spiritual and fiercely political. The more closely one looks, the more layered it becomes. There is also something moving about the fact that much of what we know comes through fragments, reconstructions, archaeology, indigenous traditions, colonial-era writings, and documents created under difficult historical circumstances. The Aztecs themselves did not leave behind long alphabetic histories in the way some other civilizations did before European contact, though they preserved information through pictorial codices, oral traditions, and memory. Much was later destroyed, transformed, or filtered through outsiders. Reconstructing their world requires patience. Even the name Aztec is a kind of simplification. Scholars often prefer Mexica when speaking specifically about the people of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. Aztec is commonly used more broadly and remains familiar in general history. Language itself reminds us that the past does not come to us in perfect clarity. We inherit labels, revise them, debate them, and try to see beyond them. In this quiet way, studying history is also an exercise in humility. As we continue through this long journey into Aztec civilization, we will move slowly through the city, the empire, the temples, the homes, the markets, the beliefs, and the dramatic final encounter with the Spanish. But for now, it is enough to rest with the image of Tenochtitlan rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco, built by people who had once been strangers in the valley, and who, through discipline, adaptation, belief, and force, transformed themselves into the center of a vast and unforgettable world. And with that image in mind, we can continue more deeply into their story, beginning with the land itself, because every civilization is, in some way, shaped by the geography that holds it. The Aztecs lived in a valley ringed by heights, in a region of lakes, volcanic shadows, seasonal rains, and fertile soils. The land offered both opportunities and constraints. It demanded invention. It rewarded organization. It also connected people through trade routes and movement across central Mexico. The Valley of Mexico was not isolated. It was part of a wider Mesoamerican world, a cultural region that shared certain agricultural traditions, religious ideas, games, calendars, artistic conventions, and exchange networks over long periods of time. The Aztecs inherited from earlier cultures, including the Olmec legacy in distant memory, the great city of Teotihuacan in nearby grandeur, the Toltecs in legend and prestige, and many Nahua-speaking traditions in language and political life. They did not invent civilization there from nothing. They entered an old conversation and made themselves its loudest voice. Tenochtitlan's rulers looked backward as well as forward. They admired the ancient city of Teotihuacan, whose ruins still stood as silent monuments in the landscape. To later peoples, Teotihuacan seemed mysterious and powerful, a place associated with origin and gods. The Aztecs linked themselves to prestigious pasts whenever possible. This was politically useful and spiritually meaningful. To claim connection to revered ancestors or legendary centers was to strengthen one's place in the present. Legitimacy mattered because empire is never based on force alone. It also depends on stories people believe, ceremonies they participate in, and symbols that order the world. The Aztecs understood this with sophistication. Public rituals displayed power. Monumental architecture made ideology visible. Royal marriages formed alliances. Tribute lists turned domination into administration. Education reproduced values. In all these ways, their civilization was not only built with stone and soil, but with meaning. For someone listening quietly at night, perhaps the most fascinating thing about the Aztecs is how alive their world feels when one slows down enough to notice its texture. This was not a flat history of dates and names. It was the smell of maize cooking in the morning, the sound of paddles against water, the shimmer of feathers in temple light, the murmur of traders in a crowded market, the discipline of students rising early, the solemn movement of priests up temple stairs, the distant outline of volcanoes watching over everything. History often becomes more restful and more human when it is imagined this way, not as a list to memorize, but as a world once inhabited by millions of lives, each with routines, worries, hopes, and beliefs. The Aztecs were not only emperors and ceremonies, they were also parents teaching children, farmers checking crops, artisans shaping beauty, merchants counting goods, and communities organizing survival in a place of both abundance and risk. In time, their empire would face a catastrophe that changed the course of history forever. But it is important not to rush toward endings too quickly. Civilizations deserve to be understood in their fullness, not only in their fall. The Aztecs created one of the great urban and political centers of the early 16th century. Their achievements in agriculture, engineering, statecraft, and symbolic culture were immense. Their worldview was coherent and powerful within its own logic. Their story is not only tragic, it is also deeply impressive. So we remain for a little longer in the rising city, among the waters and causeways, at the beginning of a long night's journey through Aztec history. And as the story continues, we can take each part slowly, letting the details gather gently until the distant world of the Mexica begins to feel, in its own quiet way, almost close enough to touch. The valley in which the Aztecs built their world was more than a backdrop. It shaped nearly everything. High in central Mexico, surrounded by mountains and volcanoes, the basin of Mexico gathered water in lakes and marshes, creating a landscape that was at once beautiful, fertile, and difficult. To live there was to be in constant conversation with the land. Water had to be crossed, controlled, redirected, and respected. Soil had to be made useful. Space had to be claimed carefully. The Mexica, who had become the dominant people of Tenochtitlan, learned to turn this demanding environment into the foundation of power. When people imagine ancient capitals, they often picture cities planted on dry ground with walls, roads, and fields spreading out around them. Tenochtitlan was different. It rose from islands in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by causeways and surrounded by shimmering water. The city was not simply built in nature, it was engineered into it. This gave it a character unlike almost any other great urban center of its time. It also meant that daily life was shaped by movement across water. Canoes passed through canals, carrying people, food, building materials, flowers, tools, and tribute goods. Streets and waterways existed side by side, creating a rhythm of traffic that was both practical and strangely graceful. The lake system itself was complex. Some lakes were fresher than others, and some were more saline. Seasonal rains could change water levels dramatically. Flooding was always a risk. In dry times, water access also mattered. This was not a place where people could build carelessly and hope for the best. The Aztecs and their neighbors had to understand the basin in detail. They had to observe how water moved, where it collected, how soils behaved, and how best to support a growing population in a fragile environment. Their success in doing so is one of the most impressive parts of their civilization. Among their best-known achievements was the development and expansion of chinampa agriculture. Chinampas are sometimes described as floating gardens, but that phrase is a little misleading. These were not rafts drifting on the lake. They were carefully made plots in shallow water or marshy areas, built up with layers of vegetation, mud, and soil to create fertile, raised fields. Trees were often planted along the edges to help anchor them. Narrow canals ran between the plots, allowing canoes to move easily through the agricultural landscape. The result was a highly productive farming system, one capable of producing multiple crops and helping support a dense urban population. It is hard to overstate the importance of this. Great cities require dependable food supplies. Tenochtitlan could not have become a major capital without a powerful agricultural base. Chinampas produced maize, beans, squash, chilies, amaranth, tomatoes, flowers, and other crops. Their fertility came from the rich mud and regular moisture of the lake environment. Farmers worked these lands intensely and skillfully. In many ways, chinampa agriculture represents the quiet genius of the Aztec world. It was not dramatic like a temple or a battlefield. It did not glitter like gold or feathers, but it fed the city. It sustained life. The people who worked these lands were deeply important, even if later histories often focused more on rulers and priests. Farmers rose early, labored steadily, understood seasonal rhythms, and carried knowledge passed through generations. They knew when to plant, how to manage moisture, how to move goods, and how to keep a fragile system productive. Their work tied the city to the wider environment. In their hands, the boundary between lake and land became something flexible, something useful, something shaped by care. Tenochtitlan itself became a city of remarkable order. Broad causeways connected it to the mainland, allowing both movement and defense. Bridges could be removed in times of danger. Canals cut through neighborhoods. Public spaces and sacred precincts were arranged with intention. The city's center was not a loose cluster of structures, but a ceremonial heart. At its core stood temples, plazas, schools, and official buildings that made visible the power of religion and rule. As the city expanded, districts formed around trades, kinship groups, and local organization. There was grandeur at the center and ordinary life all around it. One of the most fascinating aspects of Aztec urbanism is that the city was not separated from the sacred. Many modern cities keep politics, religion, trade, and domestic life in clearly distinct zones, at least in theory. Tenochtitlan was more integrated. The central ceremonial precinct was not some remote place visited only on rare occasions. It stood as the symbolic center of the world the Aztecs imagined for themselves. Rituals there affected the entire community. Processions, festivals, offerings, and state ceremonies all reinforced the idea that the city was not merely inhabited by people. It was aligned with cosmic order. At the heart of this sacred center stood the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. It was a massive stepped pyramid with twin shrines at the top, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. These two deities represented forces essential to the Aztec state. Huitzilopochtli was associated with the sun, war, and the destiny of the Mexica people. Tlaloc was associated with rain, fertility, and agricultural abundance. Together they formed a kind of sacred balance. One shrine pointed toward power and conquest, the other toward power and growth. One fed the empire through war, the other through harvest. Their pairing reveals how the Aztecs saw survival itself as something secured both by force and by nourishment. To stand before the Templo Mayor in its prime would likely have been overwhelming. Its painted surfaces, its stairways, its offerings, its commanding presence over the precinct, all would have made it more than architecture. It was a stage for ritual, a statement of identity, and a mountain built by human hands. Around it were other temples and sacred buildings, each with roles in festivals and ceremonies that marked the calendar year. Priests moved through this world with discipline and purpose, tending fires, preparing offerings, keeping ritual time, and maintaining a relationship between the human and divine. Religion in Aztec society was not a private matter. It was woven into the structure of life. Ceremonies marked agricultural cycles, victories in war, transitions in rulership, and the passing of sacred dates. There were songs, dances, costumes, incense, prayers, processions, fasting, feasting, and offerings. Ritual could be solemn, beautiful, communal, and at times severe. To understand it only through the most dramatic parts would miss much of its texture. Like many ancient religious systems, it gave shape to the year, explained the world, and gave people a place within a larger cosmic drama. That cosmic drama was rooted in a vision of a universe that required maintenance. The Aztecs believed the world was not guaranteed to continue forever without effort. Divine beings had made sacrifices to set the cosmos in motion. Human beings, in return, had responsibilities to sustain that order. This is part of why sacrifice held such importance. Modern people often recoil from this aspect of Aztec religion, and understandably so. But to the Aztecs themselves, sacrifice existed within a worldview that saw reciprocity between humans and gods as essential. The world endured because obligations were fulfilled. This sense of obligation extended beyond ritual. It shaped social behavior and moral expectation. People were not thought of as entirely free-floating individuals. They were members of households, neighborhoods, schools, lineages, and communities with duties toward one another. Respect, discipline, labor, and restraint were valued. Surviving speeches and teachings from elders emphasize humility, self-control, and proper conduct. Parents instructed children carefully. Youth were expected to learn not only practical tasks, but also how to behave in a world watched by ancestors, gods, and the wider community. The social structure of Aztec society was layered and organized. Nobles held privileges and influence, but they were expected to serve in rule, war, and ritual life. Commoners formed the broad base of society, working as farmers, craftsmen, laborers, and soldiers. There were also merchants of high status, slaves under specific conditions, and specialists whose roles gave them importance beyond simple class categories. Society was not equal, but neither was it chaotic. Rank mattered, clothing could signal status, and opportunities for advancement could come through military achievement, trade, or service. One of the most distinctive organizational units in Aztec life was the calpulli. This term can be difficult to translate neatly, but it referred to a kind of local social and territorial group, often linked by kinship, shared obligations, and landholding arrangements. Members of a calpulli might farm land, pay tribute, serve in military units, and participate in local religious life together. These groups helped structure everyday society. They made the empire manageable from below. While emperors and nobles often dominate the historical narrative, much of life was lived at this neighborhood level, where obligations were concrete and familiar. Households were the true center of ordinary life. Within them, meals were prepared, cloth was woven, children were taught, goods were stored, and routines repeated day after day. Maize was the staple of the diet and held immense cultural importance. It was not simply food, it was central to identity, survival, and sacred symbolism. Tortillas, tamales, maize gruels, and other preparations formed the basis of daily nourishment. Beans and squash complemented maize nutritionally. Chilies added flavor. Tomatoes, herbs, fruits, and local resources varied the diet. Food was both practical and deeply cultural, shaped by region, season, and status. Women played essential roles in this world. though the historical record often reflects the biases of later writers. They managed household labor, prepared food, wove textiles, raised children, and participated in trade and ritual life. Weaving in particular was a major contribution, since cloth was both a practical necessity and an economic good. Textiles could be used in tribute, exchange, and display. The making of cloth demanded patience, skill, and time. In this way, much of the empire's visible order rested on labor that was constant but easy for outsiders to overlook. Children were brought into this society with ceremony and expectation. Birth was surrounded by ritual meaning. Naming mattered. Families hoped children would grow into responsible adults, able to fulfill their place in the world. Boys and girls often faced different paths, though both were shaped by discipline and instruction. Tales of parenting in Aztec society often emphasize firmness. Children were not raised under the assumption that comfort alone prepared them for life. They were expected to learn endurance, work, and respect. The ideal adult was not impulsive, but composed. Schooling reflected these ideals. The Kalmakak, often associated with noble youths, offered advanced education in ritual, governance, history, and interpretation. The Telpochcali, more closely linked with commoners, emphasized military training, civic duty, and discipline. Yet both forms of education served a larger purpose. They shaped people into useful members of society. Knowledge was not merely personal enrichment, it was tied to service. This gives Aztec education a seriousness that still feels striking. It aimed to form character as much as skill. As Tenochtitlan grew, trade tied it ever more strongly to the wider world. Markets became places not only of exchange, but of social life. The market of Tlatelolco became especially famous. Descriptions from the early colonial period speak of huge crowds and orderly organization. There were sections for food, cloth, pottery, tools, luxury goods, medicinal plants, and countless other items. Officials supervised transactions. Buyers and sellers knew where to go. Such a market was not a minor feature of urban life. It was one of the engines of the city. Professional merchants, known as pochteka, held a particularly interesting place in society. They were traders, but not ordinary small-scale vendors. They often traveled long distances, moving valuable goods across regions, and sometimes acting as unofficial observers or intelligence gatherers for the state. Their journeys connected the empire to distant places and resources. Through them came feathers from tropical birds, cacao from warmer lands, precious stones, fine textiles, and rare goods that added luxury to elite life and ceremony. Trade extended the reach of the city far beyond what conquest alone could achieve. Luxury goods mattered because Aztec society valued display as part of status and power. Featherwork was especially admired. Brilliant feathers arranged into headdresses, shields, costumes, and ceremonial objects created a visual language of prestige. Goldsmiths, lapidaries, potters, and woodworkers also produced highly refined works. These were not merely decorative, they signaled hierarchy, honored gods, and formed part of diplomacy and tribute. Beauty itself had political weight. To create wonder was to demonstrate access to resources, skill, and order. The deeper one looks into the Aztec world, the clearer it becomes that their civilization was both practical and symbolic at every level. Agriculture fed the city, but also tied it to sacred cycles. Markets moved goods, but also displayed imperial reach. Clothing protected the body, but also signaled rank and accomplishment. Temples housed ritual, but also communicated power. Even the city's setting in the lake could be read materially as a defensive and agricultural choice. And symbolically, as a world shaped from instability into order. This order, however, was never effortless. The Aztec state required tribute, labor, ritual attention, and political management. It depended on surrounding peoples, some loyal, many not. It drew strength from expansion, and expansion created tension. The city could appear serene from a distance, its temples rising over calm water, but the machinery beneath that serenity was demanding. It had to be maintained by taxes and goods, by disciplined administration, by trained warriors, and by a belief system strong enough to keep the whole structure coherent. And still, to dwell only on that structure would miss the human feel of the city. There were ordinary mornings in Tenochtitlan. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Canoes drifted out with produce. Children moved through their lessons. Artisans settled into their work. Priests climbed temple steps. Traders prepared goods for market. Voices echoed along the canals. Dogs barked. Birds moved across the water. The city lived not only in moments of ritual spectacle, but in repetition, in habit, in 1,000 small gestures that no chronicler could ever fully preserve. This is part of what makes the Aztecs so compelling for a slow and restful history. The farther we move past simple images of warriors and sacrifice, the more complete they become. They were city builders, engineers, parents, merchants, craftsmen, teachers, and believers. They lived in a place of great environmental challenge and transformed it into one of the most striking urban centers in the world. Tenochtitlan was not accidental. It was built by people who understood land, water, labor, symbolism, and power, and who combined those understandings into a civilization both dazzling and fragile. As the city expanded and its confidence deepened, so too did the ambition of its rulers. What had begun as the rise of a once marginal people would become a larger imperial project, one that reached across central Mexico and beyond. To understand how that happened, we have to follow not only the shape of the city, but the shape of power itself, because Tenochtitlan did not remain merely a remarkable capital. It became the beating center of an empire. The transformation from ambitious city-state to imperial power did not happen all at once. It came through alliances, wars, tribute, and political skill. In the early years of their settlement in the Valley of Mexico, the Mexica were not the strongest people in the region. They often served more powerful neighbors and had to navigate a world already crowded with established cities and rival dynasties. Their rise required not only force, but also patience. They learned when to serve, when to submit, when to bargain, and when to strike. In this way, their empire was built on memory as much as ambition. They remembered what it had been like to stand at the edge of power. One of the turning points in their rise came with the defeat of Azcapotzalco, a dominant Tepanec power that had previously overshadowed them. In the shifting politics of the valley, alliances mattered. Tenochtitlan joined with Texcoco and Tlacopan in what became known as the Triple Alliance. On paper, this alliance divided the spoils of conquest among the three partners. In practice, Tenochtitlan would increasingly become the strongest of them. Still, the alliance gave the Aztecs a framework through which expansion could happen on a large scale. It was not simply a military arrangement. It was a political mechanism for empire. Empire in the Aztec world did not usually mean direct rule over every piece of land. Instead, it often meant compelling other city-states and regions to acknowledge Aztec dominance and pay tribute. Local rulers could remain in place if they complied. This was efficient. It allowed the Aztecs to extend influence without rebuilding every government from the ground up. But it also meant that imperial control rested on ongoing pressure. Subject peoples obeyed not always because they accepted Aztec rule as legitimate, but because resisting could be costly. Tribute systems create wealth, but they also create resentment. The tribute itself took many forms. Provinces delivered cotton garments, maize, beans, cacao, feathers, jaguar pelts, warrior costumes, shields, obsidian, rubber, and many other goods, depending on local resources. Surviving records give a vivid sense of this flow of wealth. One can almost imagine the goods arriving in the capital in steady streams, collected from distant lands and transformed into sustenance, prestige, military equipment, and ritual display. Tribute made Tenochtitlan richer, more powerful, and more dependent on the obedience of others. This system also reveals something important about Aztec imperial logic. Their empire was not primarily designed to settle distant territories with colonists in the way some later empires were. It was built to extract. What mattered most was reliable access to goods, manpower, and submission. Conquest opened routes and imposed obligations. The capital drew wealth inward. This made the empire dynamic, but also vulnerable. When subject regions saw a chance to rebel or align with a new enemy, many would do so. The Aztecs ruled impressively, but often without deep affection from those they dominated. War, then, was not a side activity. It was central to the maintenance of the state. Military success brought tribute, prestige, captives, and political legitimacy. Young men were encouraged to seek distinction in battle, and military achievement could bring advancement in rank and social recognition. Elite warrior societies, including the eagle and jaguar warriors, embodied the honor attached to combat. Their costumes, insignia, and ritual associations made them both feared and admired. To succeed in war was not merely to survive, it was to participate in the very expansion of the world the Aztecs had built. Yet Aztec warfare was not always aimed purely at annihilation. Capturing enemies could be more valued than killing them outright, since captives had roles in ritual and public display. War thus operated in several registers at once. It was political, economic, symbolic, and religious. This can seem strange from a modern perspective that prefers to sort actions into separate categories. The Aztecs were less interested in such separation. The battlefield could serve the gods, strengthen the state, raise a warrior's status, and provide material benefit all at once. Among the more intriguing aspects of Aztec warfare are the so-called flower wars, conflicts fought under agreed conditions between rival states, especially with Tlaxcala and others. Historians debate the exact nature and consistency of these wars, but they appear to have served purposes beyond simple territorial conquest. They provided opportunities for warriors to prove themselves and for captives to be taken. Whether highly ritualized in practice or simply remembered that way later, they reflect the extent to which combat in Mesoamerica could carry layered meanings. War was never only one thing. The ruler who stood at the center of this expanding imperial machine was the Tlatoani, the great speaker. This title suggests more than command. It implies a person whose speech carried authority, whose words represented the state, and whose position linked noble lineages, military command, and sacred legitimacy. The ruler was not a distant abstract figure. His presence mattered in ceremony, diplomacy, and state decision-making. Yet his authority was not unlimited. He operated within a noble order, with advisors, expectations, and institutions that gave the empire continuity beyond any single life. Several rulers helped shape Aztec expansion, but one especially important figure was Itzcoatl, under whom the alliance against Azcapotzalco succeeded. Later rulers, such as Motecuhzoma I, expanded the reach and prestige of the empire even further. Each reign built on previous gains, victories accumulated, tribute routes widened, ritual life grew more elaborate. Tenochtitlan's self-image deepened. The city did not see itself as merely fortunate. It saw itself as chosen, central, and destined. This sense of destiny was reinforced by history as the Aztecs told it. They did not simply record the past as a neutral sequence of events. They shaped memory into legitimacy. Some histories were emphasized while others were set aside. Ancestors were elevated. Connections to prestigious older traditions were highlighted. The Mexica had once been migrants and outsiders, but under imperial rule, they became narrators of civilization. They placed themselves into a larger sacred story in which hardship, migration, divine guidance, and triumph all led toward Tenochtitlan. The state, in a way, authored itself. Texcoco, one of the alliance partners, played a particularly important cultural role in this world. It was known as a center of learning, poetry, and law, and its ruler, Nezahualcóyotl, became famous for wisdom as well as political skill. His presence reminds us that the Aztec imperial sphere was not intellectually simple. There were traditions of philosophy, reflection, poetry, and formal speech that gave depth to elite culture, questions of fate, transience, glory, and the fragility of human life appear in surviving poetic traditions associated with Nahua thought. Even in an empire built through war, there was room for contemplation. This poetic dimension is one of the gentlest windows into Aztec civilization. Some surviving Nahua poems reflect on flowers, song, mortality, and the uncertainty of earthly existence. They ask what endures, what can be trusted, and whether beauty offers a kind of truth in a passing world. These themes feel unexpectedly intimate across the centuries. They remind us that the Aztecs were not only administrators of tribute or performers of ritual, but also thinkers who lived with uncertainty. They knew power could fade. They knew life was brief. Their empire rose under the shadow of impermanence, even if it did not yet know how near its ending was. Religion remained essential to imperial power. Rulers sponsored ceremonies, enlarged temples, and staged events that bound conquest to cosmic meaning. Captives from war could become offerings in rituals that dramatized the ruler's strength and the god's continuing favor. The Templo Mayor itself was rebuilt and expanded multiple times, each new phase larger and more imposing. Construction thus became political theology in stone. To enlarge the temple was to enlarge the state's claim on the world. Architecture proclaimed victory. The empire's reach into many regions also brought cultural contact. The Aztecs ruled over peoples with different languages, traditions, and local gods. They could be flexible in some respects, allowing local life to continue so long as tribute and obedience were maintained. This flexibility helped the empire function, but it did not erase friction. Some regions were more tightly controlled than others. Some resisted repeatedly. Some paid reluctantly while preserving deep hostility beneath the surface. Underneath the apparent order of empire, there was always tension. Among the most significant enemies of the Aztecs were the Tlaxcalans, who remained independent despite constant conflict. Their survival matters greatly in the broader arc of history, because they would later become key allies of the Spanish. This is a reminder that empires do not fall only because an outside force arrives. They fall because that outside force finds openings. The Aztecs created many achievements, but they also created enemies. The very tribute system that enriched Tenochtitlan made imperial collapse easier once a credible alternative appeared. Still, during its height, the empire must have seemed formidable. Goods flowed inward. Armies moved outward. Rituals affirmed divine support. The city grew magnificent. Markets swelled with trade. Nobles displayed wealth. Warriors sought glory. Farmers sustained the system. Priests interpreted sacred time. From within Tenochtitlan, the world may have felt ordered under Aztec ascendancy. The capital stood at the center of roads, causeways, tribute routes, ceremonies, and stories. It was not only politically dominant, it was psychologically central. This confidence perhaps reached one of its fullest expressions under Motecuhzoma II, the ruler whom the Spanish would encounter. By the time he came to power, the empire was wealthy, ceremonially elaborate, and widely feared. Motecuhzoma governed with seriousness and grandeur. Accounts suggest a court marked by protocol and distance, where rank was carefully managed and imperial dignity strongly performed. He inherited not a fragile beginning, but a mature imperial system. Yet mature systems often hide their weaknesses best. They can appear strongest just before the strain becomes visible. To listen calmly to this part of the story is to hear both greatness and vulnerability moving together. The Aztec Empire was real, organized, wealthy, and deeply impressive. It was not a myth waiting to be scattered by a few foreigners. It was a major power built through generations of effort, but it was also a power held together by tribute, coercion, symbolism, and belief. Such structures can stand for long periods. They can also shift suddenly when pressure comes from the right places. Before that pressure arrives in our story, it is worth dwelling a little longer in the world the Aztecs made at their height. Imagine the capital receiving tribute from far regions. Imagine noble processions moving through temple precincts. Imagine warriors returning with honor. Imagine the market at Tlatelolco alive, with voices and goods from many lands. Imagine students reciting teachings, priests watching the calendar, and families carrying on with ordinary routines below the rising temples. This was the empire not as a diagram, but as a lived reality. It is easy in history to race toward famous endings. The arrival of Cortés, the siege, the collapse of Tenochtitlan, and the transformation of Mesoamerica often dominate the narrative, but the empire itself deserves space before that ending begins. It was not simply waiting to be destroyed. It was functioning, adapting, commanding, and believing in its own continuity. The people within it did not know they were nearing a turning point that later generations would mark as world-changing. They lived inside the ordinary confidence of the present, as people always do, and so we stay with them a little longer, in the stillness before the storm, when the city remains whole and the empire still believes in tomorrow. The lakes still reflect the temples. The causeways remain busy. The tribute arrives. The rituals continue. The songs of flowers and mortality still make sense within a world not yet broken. But beyond the horizon, other sails, other intentions, and other diseases are moving toward them. And in the next stretch of this journey, the long-built order of the Aztec world will begin to meet forces it could not fully foresee. By the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire stood at a point of immense power. Tenochtitlan was wealthy, highly organized, and deeply confident in its place at the center of the world it had built. Tribute flowed in from many regions. Markets remained crowded with goods from near and far. Priests kept the sacred calendar in motion. Warriors pursued honor. Rulers governed through ceremony and command, and ordinary families continued their routines within a society that seemed stable, ordered, and enduring. From within the city, the future may have felt secure, even if the empire had enemies and tensions beyond its borders. Yet history often changes, while daily life still appears normal. In the streets of Tenochtitlan, people still cooked maize in the morning, crossed canals by canoe, worked in workshops, and gathered in marketplaces. Children still learned discipline and custom. Priests still burned incense and prepared for ritual observances. The chinampas still produced food, and the city still rose from the lake with extraordinary confidence. But far away, movements were already beginning that would eventually reach central Mexico and alter everything. The people of the valley could not yet see how close the wider world was coming. When Spanish expeditions arrived on the Gulf Coast, the event did not immediately become, in Aztec eyes, the end of an era. At first, these newcomers were part of a confusing and uncertain development on the empire's edge. Reports traveled inward through messengers, descriptions, and rumor. Strange men had come from the sea. They carried unfamiliar weapons. They wore metal. They traveled with animals unlike any seen before in the region. Their arrival was startling, but the Aztec world had long experience with diplomacy, war, omens, and the arrival of troubling news. This was alarming, but not yet fully understood. As information moved through the empire, rulers and nobles had to decide how to interpret it. This is one of the most human parts of the story. No one was reading from a finished history book. No one knew which details would later seem decisive. They were simply living through uncertainty. Some reports may have sounded exaggerated. Others may have seemed important, but not unprecedented. What should be feared more, the strangers themselves, or the possibility that subject peoples and rivals might use the moment for their own advantage? Empires are rarely threatened by one thing alone. They are threatened by combinations. Motecuhzoma II ruled at this moment of gathering uncertainty. He has often been described in dramatic ways, especially in later colonial accounts that may not always be fair to him. Some portray him as hesitant, overly concerned with omens, or unable to act decisively. But such portrayals can oversimplify a far more difficult reality. He was the ruler of a large empire, facing an unfamiliar development that involved diplomacy, intelligence, military risk, and sacred interpretation all at once. His position required caution as much as strength. A reckless response could be disastrous, but so could hesitation. This uncertainty was made even more difficult by the political structure of the empire itself. Tenochtitlan was powerful, but it ruled over many peoples who had reason to resent tribute demands and Aztec domination. Some cities had submitted unwillingly. Others watched constantly for chances to resist. The empire was formidable, but it was not united in affection. This meant that any external force entering the region had the potential to become more dangerous if it could attract indigenous allies. The real threat was never just a few foreign newcomers. It was the possibility that they might be woven into existing local rivalries. And that is exactly what began to happen. As the Spanish moved inland, they did not simply march alone through hostile territory. They encountered communities with their own agendas, their own histories, and their own grievances against the Aztecs. Some resisted the newcomers, others chose to negotiate. Some eventually became allies. This shifting web of relationships is essential to understanding what followed. The story is not one of a single invading force overpowering a passive empire. It is the story of multiple peoples making decisions within a rapidly changing political landscape. For listeners in the present, this part of Aztec history can be especially fascinating because it reveals how fragile power becomes when its enemies are numerous and its authority depends on tribute and fear. Tenochtitlan had wealth, armies, ceremony, and prestige, but it could not fully control how others interpreted the arrival of the Spanish. Some may have seen danger, others may have seen opportunity. Still others may simply have hoped to survive by choosing the least dangerous path. In times of uncertainty, people do not all move together. They calculate differently. Meanwhile, life in the capital continued under the surface of growing anxiety. It is easy to imagine history as changing all at once, but in reality, it often changes unevenly. In one part of the empire, reports of strangers spread. In another, tribute was still being collected. In the city, food still entered the markets, ceremonies still followed the calendar, and neighborhoods still kept their routines. This contrast between ordinary life and approaching crisis gives the moment a particular tension. The empire was still functioning, yet something new had entered its world, and no one could fully measure its consequences. Messages from the coast and inland routes likely became more troubling over time. The strangers were not disappearing, they were moving, they were forming relationships, they were asking questions, observing carefully, and learning the land through both force and negotiation. Their leader, Hernan Cortés, was ambitious and politically opportunistic. He was not simply exploring. He was trying to build a position of power inside a world he barely understood, and he did so by exploiting divisions already present within it. This is one reason the conquest cannot be understood as a matter of European weapons alone. It depended on reading and manipulating the fractured politics of central Mexico. The Aztecs themselves were also skilled political actors, of course. Their empire had been built through alliances, coercion, tribute, diplomacy, and war. They knew how to dominate a region of competing states, but their system had evolved within a Mesoamerican framework. The Spanish brought not only new tools and tactics, but a new set of motives shaped by imperial ambition, Christian expansion, personal greed, and earlier patterns of conquest in the Caribbean. The meeting of these worlds created confusion on both sides. Neither encountered the other in fully transparent terms. This chapter of history, therefore, deserves to unfold slowly. It is not only about conflict, it is also about misunderstanding. Each side interpreted the other through its own assumptions. The Aztecs had to determine what kind of force these newcomers represented, and whether they could be managed through existing forms of political contact. The Spanish, for their part, saw wealth, opportunity, and a powerful empire they hoped to penetrate and ultimately control. Between these positions lay a dangerous field of misreading, improvisation, and escalating tension. As the newcomers advanced, the emotional atmosphere in the empire must have grown increasingly complex. Curiosity and caution may have mixed with fear. Nobles and priests may have debated omens, strategies, and possible intentions. Subject peoples may have weighed rebellion more seriously. Rulers in other cities may have asked themselves whether the Aztecs would remain dominant or whether the political order of the region was beginning to shift. Such moments are rarely clear while they are happening. They feel unstable because they are unstable. And still Tenochtitlan stood in its beauty. The temples had not yet fallen. The markets still breathed with trade. Canoes still crossed the canals. The causeways still linked the city to the land around it. In the sacred precinct, fire still burned, and ceremonies still affirmed a cosmos that, for the moment, remained intact. This is the image worth holding at the close of this chapter. Not the fall, not yet the siege, but the great city at the edge of change, still whole, still ordered, still unaware of exactly how much of its world is about to be tested. From here, the story will move deeper into the first meetings, the growing tension between Motecuhzoma and the Spanish, and the unstable path that leads the strangers into the heart of Tenochtitlan itself. As the Spanish and their indigenous allies moved closer toward the center of the Aztec world, the situation became more delicate with every step. This was no longer a distant rumor from the coast, no longer a strange report carried inward by messengers. The newcomers were advancing through real cities, meeting real rulers, fighting real battles, and entering more deeply into the political fabric of central Mexico. Each new encounter added weight to the question facing the Aztec leadership. How should such a force be handled before it became impossible to contain? For Motecuhzoma II, this was not simply a military question. It was a diplomatic question, a ceremonial question, and perhaps also a sacred one. Rulership in the Aztec world was not limited to commanding armies. The emperor had to preserve dignity, interpret threats, maintain alliances, oversee tribute, and embody the stability of the imperial center. Every response carried symbolic meaning. To welcome strangers too openly could seem weak. To attack too quickly could provoke chaos. To hesitate could allow danger to grow. The difficulty of the moment lay partly in the fact that there was no perfect choice. The Spanish, meanwhile, were learning rapidly. As they traveled inland, they gathered information from allies, interpreters, and local encounters. They learned who hated the Aztecs, which roads mattered, how tribute systems worked, and where tensions could be exploited. They were not simply advancing by force, they were advancing by observation. In this sense, the conquest began as much with listening and manipulation as with battle. Cortés, in particular, showed a talent for turning confusion into advantage. He studied the divisions of the region and inserted himself into them. One of the most important figures in this process was Malintzin, often known in Spanish sources as Doña Marina or La Malinche. She served as an interpreter and intermediary, helping make communication possible between the Spanish and many indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica. Her role has been debated and reinterpreted for centuries, and she remains one of the most complex figures in the history of the conquest. What matters here is that language itself became a form of power. To translate was not merely to repeat words. It was to shape negotiations, explain intentions, soften danger, sharpen threats, and connect worlds that otherwise could not speak directly to one another. As these lines of communication developed, the Spanish moved through lands where Aztec power was known, feared, and resented. Some communities resisted them. Others offered support. The Tlaxcalans, after first fighting fiercely against the Spaniards, eventually became crucial allies. This alliance changed the scale of the conflict. The Spanish were few in number compared with the populations around them, but with indigenous allies, they became part of a much larger force. The road to Tenochtitlan was no longer a road walked by outsiders alone. It was now carried forward by many different peoples, each with their own reasons. This is one of the most important truths about the coming crisis. Tenochtitlan was not facing a single invading army from overseas. It was facing a coalition forming around its own enemies. The empire's strength had always depended on tribute and dominance, but those same structures produced bitterness. Subject peoples had long memories. Some had paid goods and labor unwillingly for years. Some had seen their autonomy reduced under Aztec pressure. Some now looked at the arrival of the Spanish and saw, if not salvation, then at least an opening. In history, great powers are often weakened not only by the strength of outsiders, but by the depth of resentment they have created. As the foreign-led coalition advanced, Motecuhzoma appears to have sent gifts, messages, and envoys. These actions have sometimes been interpreted as signs of uncertainty or attempts at appeasement, but they can also be understood as efforts to gather information, project imperial authority, and manage a developing crisis at a distance. In a world shaped by formal exchange, symbolism, and hierarchy, gifts were not simple tokens of friendliness. They could signal recognition, warning, wealth, and power all at once. The Aztec court was engaging in diplomacy, not surrender. Yet the gifts themselves may also have sharpened Spanish ambitions. Gold, fine textiles, crafted objects, and ceremonial items revealed the immense wealth of the empire more clearly than any rumor could. To men already motivated by reward, the splendor of Aztec material culture was not merely impressive, it was provoking. What the Aztecs may have intended as controlled gestures of statecraft could be read by the Spanish as proof that even greater riches lay ahead. In this way, diplomacy itself could feed danger. Actions meant to define limits could instead attract deeper intrusion. The emotional mood in Tenochtitlan during this time is impossible to note in full, but one can imagine a growing unease beneath the city's ordinary rhythms. Reports must have accumulated. Nobles and advisors likely debated what the emperor should do. Priests may have searched for meaning in the sacred calendar, in omens, in ritual signs, or in the unusual shape of events. Merchants and travelers may have carried fresh rumors into the markets. Ordinary people, too, must have sensed that something was shifting, even if they did not know exactly what. The city was still functioning, still grand, still full of life, but uncertainty was beginning to move through it. And still the beauty of Tenochtitlan remained. It is important to keep that image alive as the tension grows. The city still rose over the lake with its canals, causeways, temples, and districts. The chinampas still supplied food. The market at Tlatelolco still drew crowds. In the sacred precinct, ceremonies still took place according to the turning of sacred time. The empire had not yet collapsed into violence. Its structures still held. That is what makes this phase of the story so compelling. It is the moment when a civilization is still itself, still intact, and yet already moving toward an encounter that will test every one of its foundations. When the Spanish and their allies eventually approached the capital more closely, the decision was made to admit them into Tenochtitlan. This remains one of the most studied and debated choices in Aztec history. Why allow such dangerous strangers into the heart of the empire? The answer likely lies in a mix of factors rather than a single cause. Motecuhzoma may have hoped to manage them through controlled hospitality, to observe them more closely, to keep them under watch, or to avoid immediate large-scale war in a setting where their intentions were not yet fully fixed. There may also have been political and ceremonial expectations shaping how rulers dealt with high-status visitors, even threatening ones. When the strangers entered the city, the meeting between the Spanish and the Aztec capital must have felt extraordinary to both sides. For the newcomers, Tenochtitlan was unlike anything they had expected. It was larger, more ordered, and more visually striking than most had imagined possible in the interior of the Americas. The canals, white buildings, broad causeways, towering temples, and bustling market life made a profound impression. For the Aztecs, meanwhile, this was the controlled arrival of an uncertain force into the ceremonial center of their world. Both sides were looking, calculating, interpreting. Both sides knew they were in a moment of unusual significance, even if neither yet understood its full cost. The encounter between Cortés and Motecuhzoma has often been retold in grand dramatic language, but beneath the later storytelling stood a very human tension. Two political cultures, two systems of power, two ways of understanding rulership and legitimacy were standing face to face. Each side likely sought to appear confident. Each side likely concealed fear behind formality. The emperor would have had to preserve imperial dignity before his court and people. Cortés would have had to project boldness before allies and enemies alike. The meeting was not peaceful simplicity. It was compressed danger wrapped in ceremony. At first, the arrangement held, but only uneasily. The Spanish remained in the city as guests, yet they were armed guests with their own agenda. Motecuhzoma remained emperor, yet his freedom to act narrowed as the foreigners studied the city, watched its leaders, and judged its vulnerabilities. Hospitality and suspicion coexisted. Ritual courtesy and strategic calculation sat side by side. This kind of tension cannot remain stable forever. When two powers share the same space, while distrusting one another, every misunderstanding becomes more dangerous. The Spanish, recognizing both the wealth of the city and the uncertainty of their own position, soon made a move that changed the balance dramatically. Motecuhzoma was effectively taken into custody within his own capital. This was a bold and astonishing act. It turned the emperor into a ruler under pressure and gave Cortés leverage over the city without openly seizing it by force. It also revealed the strange shape of this conquest in its early stage. The Spanish did not yet have the numbers to crush Tenochtitlan outright. Instead, they tried to control the empire by holding its center symbolically and politically. For the people of the city, this must have been a deeply unsettling period. Their ruler still existed, still spoke, still occupied his place in some formal sense, yet the order around him had been disturbed. Nobles had to decide how to behave. Priests had to continue ceremonies. Common people had to go on living, while a dangerous ambiguity hung over the capital. Was the emperor still fully sovereign? Were the newcomers under control? Or were they slowly taking command? Uncertainty can exhaust a city even before violence begins. This phase matters because it shows that the fall of the Aztec world was not a single sudden collapse. It began with tension, caution, misreading, and unstable coexistence. It began in rooms where people watched each other carefully. It began in formal speeches whose politeness concealed danger. It began in gifts, messages, quiet calculations, and the slow realization that neither side could fully bend the other into a manageable shape. The city was still standing in its brilliance, but inside that brilliance, pressure was building. Soon that pressure would break open more violently. Suspicion would sharpen into bloodshed, and the uneasy presence of the Spanish within Tenochtitlan would become something far more explosive. In the next part of the story, the fragile balance inside the capital begins to fail, and the first great rupture between the Aztecs and the newcomers reshapes everything that follows. Soon, the unstable balance inside Tenochtitlan began to break. What had until then been a tense and carefully managed coexistence between the Aztec leadership and the Spanish presence inside the city was becoming harder to sustain. The strangers were no longer simply dangerous guests under watch. They were armed men living at the heart of the empire, studying its rhythms, relying on fear, and trying to control events through pressure and intimidation. The Aztecs, meanwhile, were living under an arrangement that had become increasingly humiliating and dangerous. Their ruler remained in place, but under conditions that made his authority uncertain. Their city remained standing, but with a foreign force lodged inside it. It was the kind of situation that could not remain still for long. The emotional strain of such a period must have been immense. In the streets and neighborhoods of the capital, daily life still continued outwardly. Food still had to be prepared. Water still had to be carried. Goods still moved through the market. Priests still had sacred duties. Families still gathered in their homes at the end of the day. But over all of this ordinary life hung a growing sense that the center of the world had become unstable. The emperor, who should have embodied the strength and balance of the empire, was now entangled in the presence of men whose intentions were impossible to trust. The sacred center of the city, which should have been inviolable, was now shadowed by foreign ambition. Cortés understood that his position was still precarious. He and his men were inside one of the largest and most powerful cities in the region, surrounded by a population that greatly outnumbered them. Their survival depended on maintaining leverage, fear, and confusion. That meant keeping control over Motecuhzoma for as long as possible and preventing the city from fully uniting against them. But fear is not stable forever. It can suppress anger for a time, yet if the pressure grows too severe, anger eventually breaks through. The Spanish had entered Tenochtitlan partly through diplomacy, partly through calculated boldness, and partly through the empire's own uncertainty. Remaining there would prove even more difficult. One of the major turning points came while Cortés himself was temporarily absent from the city. He had gone to confront another Spanish force sent from the coast, leaving part of his men behind in Tenochtitlan under the command of Pedro de Alvarado. This detail matters because it shows how unstable the entire conquest still was. The Spanish were not moving forward as a single, unquestioned machine. They faced rivalries among themselves, shifting priorities, and uncertain command. Yet even with this instability, the tension inside Tenochtitlan continued to build. During this period came one of the most explosive moments in the entire encounter. The massacre during a major religious festival in the sacred precinct, often linked to the festival of Tenochtitlan. Aztec nobles and celebrants had gathered for ceremony, music, dance, and ritual observance. Then the Spaniards attacked. The killings were brutal and sudden. Men who had come into the ceremonial space, unarmed for ritual, were cut down. The sacred setting only deepened the horror. This was not merely an act of violence. It was a rupture at the religious and political heart of the city. Blood had been spilled in one of the most symbolically charged places in the Aztec world. The reasons behind the attack have been debated. The Spaniards may have feared an uprising. They may have acted out of panic, aggression, greed, or a mixture of all three. But whatever their motives, the result was clear. Any fragile possibility that the city might continue tolerating their presence was shattered. The massacre transformed resentment into open fury. It made coexistence impossible. The Aztecs could endure uncertainty for a time. They could endure insult for a time. But an assault within the sacred center of the city, during ceremony itself, crossed a line that could not be repaired. The city rose. The Spanish, once lodged inside Tenochtitlan with carefully preserved leverage, now found themselves trapped in an increasingly hostile environment. Streets, courtyards, and surrounding spaces became dangerous. Aztec resistance hardened. The capital was no longer containing the foreigners. It was turning against them. This is an important moment because it reminds us that the Aztecs were not passive witnesses to their own conquest. They responded with force, with courage, and with determination when the limits of endurance had been crossed. In the midst of this crisis stood Motecuhzoma, still caught between roles that had become nearly impossible to reconcile. He was emperor, yet his authority had been compromised. He was expected to stabilize the city, yet the very presence of the Spanish had made stability nearly impossible. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next, especially in the matter of his death. Some later sources claim he was struck by projectiles from his own people while attempting to calm them. Others suggest the Spaniards themselves were responsible. The truth remains uncertain. What is clear is that Motecuhzoma died during this period of extreme upheaval, and with his death, the already fragile political arrangement inside the city collapsed even further. The death of a ruler in such a moment carries more than personal tragedy. It deepens disorder. it shakes the symbolic core of the state. The Aztec Emperor was not just an administrator. He stood at the intersection of power, ritual, lineage, and imperial legitimacy. To lose him while foreign invaders occupied the city and violence spread through the sacred center was to suffer a blow both political and psychological. Leadership passed onward, but under conditions of chaos, anger, and emergency. The Spanish now needed escape more than control. Whatever hope they had once had of quietly dominating the city from within had failed. Tenochtitlan had become too dangerous for them to hold. They decided to flee, attempting to leave the city under cover of darkness along the causeways. This retreat would become famous in Spanish memory as La Noche Triste, the sad night. The name captures their grief and shock, but from the Aztec perspective, it was a moment of fierce resistance, proof that the invaders could be driven out at terrible cost. The retreat was disastrous for the Spaniards. Laden with treasure, moving through narrow routes, and trying to cross the lake-bound approaches to the city, they became vulnerable. Aztec forces attacked them with intensity. Warriors struck from canoes, from the causeways, and from the city around them. Many Spaniards and allies were killed. Gold, weapons, bodies, and animals fell into the waters. The escape turned into chaos. What had entered the city in confidence now tried to leave in desperation. This event matters deeply because it interrupts the false idea that the conquest of the Aztec world was quick or easy. It was not. The Aztecs could fight effectively. They could mobilize. They could inflict devastating losses. The Spanish were not unstoppable. At this stage, they had survived, but only barely. Their enemies had proven strong, organized, and capable of turning the capital itself into a trap. And yet, despite this major setback for the invaders, the broader balance of history was already shifting in more terrible ways. Even while battles were being fought and leadership was changing, disease had begun to spread. Smallpox, brought from the Old World, moved into populations with no previous exposure. This was one of the most devastating forces in the entire conquest, and perhaps the most merciless. An army can be resisted, a siege can be endured, but epidemic disease enters homes, families, and bodies in ways no courage can fully stop. Smallpox did not strike only warriors. It struck the whole fabric of society. It killed ordinary people, nobles, laborers, parents, children, priests, and leaders. It weakened communities before they could recover from military defeat. It interrupted food production, communication, ceremony, and governance. It filled the world with suffering that no political decision could fully answer. In a densely connected society like that of the Aztec capital and its surrounding regions, the effects would have been enormous. Entire communities were left grieving while still facing invasion. For the Aztecs, this created a new kind of crisis. They were no longer dealing only with foreign men and hostile allies. They were dealing with a force that seemed to move invisibly and indiscriminately through the population. Disease magnified every other problem. It made organizing resistance harder. It weakened the defenders physically and emotionally. It robbed the state of continuity just when continuity mattered most. The conquest was therefore never only a story of steel, cavalry, and battlefield decisions. It was also a story of biological catastrophe on a civilizational scale. After escaping from Tenochtitlan, the Spanish and their allies regrouped. They were wounded, diminished, and shaken, but they were not finished. Their indigenous alliances still held. Their ambition remained. And now the defenders of the Aztec world were facing not only the memory of battle, but also the growing impact of epidemic disease and leadership upheaval. The struggle was entering a new stage, one even more destructive than what had come before. Within Tenochtitlan, The city must have felt changed after these events. The sacred center had been violated. The emperor was dead. The invaders had been driven out, but not destroyed. Disease was spreading. The confidence that had once filled the imperial capital could no longer rest on ceremony and order alone. The city was still magnificent, still capable of resistance, still deeply alive. But it was now moving into a period of siege, grief, and exhaustion. What followed would be the long and terrible contest for the survival of the capital itself. The Spanish would return. Their allies would return. The struggle would shift from unstable occupation to full-scale destruction. And the city that had once seemed to rise almost dreamlike from the waters of Lake Texcoco would soon be forced to endure one of the most brutal sieges in the history of the Americas. In the final stage of the struggle, Tenochtitlan was no longer the confident imperial capital it had once been, shining above the waters of Lake Texcoco with its temples, markets, causeways, and canals. It had become a city under unbearable pressure. The Spanish had returned after their earlier escape, and this time they came better prepared, supported by large numbers of indigenous allies who had their own reasons for fighting against Aztec power. What had once been a tense political encounter had now become a full siege. The capital was surrounded not only by enemies, but by exhaustion, hunger, grief, and disease. This is an important part of the story because it reminds us that the fall of the Aztec world did not happen in a single dramatic instant. It happened gradually through attrition. The city was attacked from multiple directions. The causeways that linked Tenochtitlan to the mainland became deadly contested routes. The waters of the lake, once a source of movement and protection, became part of the battlefield. The Spanish used brigantines, small armed vessels, to challenge Aztec control on the water. Canoes, which had once carried food, flowers, and daily goods through the life of the city, now moved through danger. Familiar spaces were transformed by war. Inside Tenochtitlan, conditions worsened steadily. Food grew scarce. Clean water became harder to secure. Disease spread through the population, striking people already weakened by stress and loss. Families who had once lived within the ordered rhythms of imperial life now endured fear and uncertainty from one day to the next. There is something especially tragic in imagining a city built with such care, intelligence, and discipline being slowly broken apart not only by battle, but by the collapse of ordinary life. Markets could not function as they once had. Ritual life could not continue in its old confidence. Homes became places of hunger and mourning, and yet the resistance did not simply vanish. The defenders of Tenochtitlan fought with extraordinary determination. The city did not surrender at the first sign of hardship. It resisted street by street, district by district, canal by canal. Leadership passed to Cuauhtémoc, who would become known as the last Aztec emperor. Under him, the defense continued even as the situation became more desperate. His role has echoed through history because he came to symbolize not only political leadership, but final endurance. Even when the larger structure of the empire was collapsing, there were still people willing to stand for the city. The battles themselves must have been chaotic, brutal, and exhausting. Urban warfare is always destructive, and in a city like Tenochtitlan, with its canals, causeways, densely built spaces, and sacred precincts, every movement carried risk. The Spanish and their allies pushed inward. The defenders struck back where they could. Buildings were damaged, routes were blocked, and fought over. The beauty of the capital, so often admired by those who first saw it, was steadily consumed by violence. A city that had once seemed almost dreamlike from a distance was being turned into a place of rubble, smoke, and suffering. It is also essential to remember that the Aztecs were not defeated by Spaniards alone. This is one of the most important truths in the whole story. The forces against Tenochtitlan included many indigenous groups, especially those who had long resented Aztec rule and tribute demands. These allies helped make the siege possible. They brought manpower, local knowledge, and deep motivation of their own. The fall of the Aztec capital was therefore not simply the triumph of one foreign power over another civilization. It was also the violent unraveling of a regional political order in which long-standing enemies seized their opportunity. At the same time, disease remained one of the darkest forces working against the defenders. Smallpox and other Old World diseases moved through populations that had no prior immunity, leaving devastation behind them. This weakened resistance in ways that cannot be measured only in military terms. Disease kills leaders, laborers, children, priests, messengers, and farmers alike. It damages the social fabric itself. Even the strongest city becomes vulnerable when illness spreads faster than help, when grief touches every household, and when the living must continue resisting while surrounded by death. In that sense, the fall of Tenochtitlan was not only a conquest, it was a civilizational catastrophe. As the siege dragged on, the structures that had once made the Aztec capital so impressive became harder and harder to sustain. The city had depended on movement, supply, agriculture, ritual coordination, and imperial authority. Under siege, all of those things suffered. The city's greatness had always rested on systems working together: chinampa, agriculture, trade routes, tribute networks, water management, political hierarchy, sacred ceremony. But siege warfare tears systems apart. Once the flow of food, goods, information, and security begins to fail, even the most remarkable capital becomes fragile. Tenochtitlan had been one of the great cities of its age, but even great cities can be starved, surrounded, and worn down. When the end finally came in 1521, it was not simply the defeat of an army. It was the collapse of a world centered on the lake city. Temples were damaged or destroyed. Political authority was broken. Sacred spaces were violated or replaced. The city itself, once the beating heart of the empire, was left in ruins. In time, Spanish colonial rule would build over it, reusing stones from Aztec buildings and reshaping the landscape into what would become Mexico City. The physical world of Tenochtitlan was buried under new structures, new institutions, and a new colonial order. And yet, even here, the story does not end in total disappearance. The Aztec Empire fell. But the Aztec people did not simply vanish from history. Their descendants lived on. Nahuatl continued to be spoken. Traditions, memories, foods, customs, and local identities endured, even as they were changed by colonial life. Archaeology, surviving texts, oral traditions, and indigenous memory have all helped keep the Aztec world visible across the centuries. Beneath modern Mexico City, the older city still remains in part, waiting in stones, foundations, offerings, and buried walls. It was covered, but not erased. That may be one of the most moving things about the Aztecs. Their empire ended violently, but their presence in history continued. Their story survived because human cultures rarely disappear as neatly as conquerors imagine. Empires can fall. Capitals can be destroyed. Temples can be pulled down. But memory remains stubborn. Language remains stubborn. Descendants remain stubborn. The Aztecs endured not as a ruling empire, but as a people whose world had been transformed and whose legacy still lived on in countless visible and invisible ways. And so, when we look back on the Aztecs now, we should not remember them only for their fall. We should remember the world they built before that fall. We should remember the city rising from the lake, the chinampas green with crops, the markets filled with voices, the causeways stretching over the water, the temples catching the sunlight, and the ordinary people whose labor made that civilization possible. Their ending was tragic, but their existence was extraordinary. Tenochtitlan was one of the great achievements of the ancient Americas, and the people who built it deserve to be remembered for far more than the moment it was lost. In the end, the story of the Aztecs is both a story of destruction and a story of endurance. Their capital was conquered, their empire was broken, and their world was forced into transformation. But they did not disappear into silence. They remain in history, in memory, in language, in archaeology, and in the continuing life of the land they once ruled. And perhaps that is why the Aztecs still hold such power in the imagination today, because theirs was not only a lost civilization, but a brilliant one. And even after the fall of Tenochtitlan, the echo of that world never fully faded.